Chapter 7 The Cheetah 2 days later, James's go-kart was almost finished. "There," James said proudly from the driveway. "It just needs some paint now. What do you think of the go-kart, Mandy?" Blackie gave a short bark and leaped up at James's chest. "Sit," said Mandy, and to her surprise, Blackie sat and looked up at her. Mandy gave him a pat, making a fuss over him being such a good dog, and looked at the go-kart. It sat outside the garage at Lilac Cottage, the spokes of its wheels polished and sparkling in the sun. "It's terrific," she said. James beamed, and even Grandpa looked proud. "I'm pretty pleased with it myself," he said, looking at the finished product. There was an open box mounted on the back, with a seat built into it. Mandy looked at the long piece of wood, with a crossbar on the end, that stretched from below the seat to the front of the go-kart. "What's that?" she said. James got into the go-kart and sat on the seat. "It's for steering," he said, putting his feet on the crossbar and pushing. "It's like kind of a rudder." Mandy watched at the front wheels as they turned from side to side. James picked up the looped rope that was lying across the front of the go-kart. "And that's the guide rope," Grandpa said. "James can control the go-kart with his feet and his hands." "Wow," said Mandy. "You're a genius, Grandpa." Grandpa laughed. "You're a bit of a genius yourself," he said, looking down at Blackie, who was sitting quietly by Mandy's feet. "You've certainly got Blackie well on the way to being the model puppy." Mandy laughed. "Grandma's the one who's really good with him," she said. She turned to James. "What animal are you going to name your go-kart after?" she said. James stuck a hand in his back pocket and pulled out a picture he had cut out of a magazine. It was a very large cat with a reddish-yellow coat, broken up by solid black spots. There were stripes running from the corner of its eyes down the side of its nose. "It's a cheetah," she said. James nodded. "Did you know that the cheetah is the fastest animal in the world?" he said. "There are records of them running at speeds of up to 68 miles per hour. So, if I've got the fastest go-kart, it ought to be named after the fastest animal." "We can paint it in cheetah colors," said Mandy. "I've got some black paint, and we can mix red and yellow to get the base color, James. Your go-kart is going to be the nicest one in Welford." Grandpa pointed to the cans of paint piled up at the side of the garage. "Paint and brushes," he said. "You two better get started." The gate of the back garden opened, and Mandy looked up. Jack was coming up the path with his mother. "And here's my other apprentice carpenter," Grandpa said, smiling. "Hello, Mrs. Gardner. How are you settling in?" Mrs. Gardner came up the path toward them. "I think we're getting there," she said. "But there's so much work to do. I just came to thank you for all your help building this hutch with Jack." Mandy grinned. "Grandpa is loving it," she said. "Aren't you, Grandpa?" Mr. Hope laughed. "I certainly am," he said. "Your Jack is going to turn into a fine carpenter." Jack beamed with pride as Mandy turned to him. "Hi, Jack," she said. "Where have you been? You look like you've got good news." "Hoppy opened his eyes today," he said excitedly. "I've just been to see him." "Hoppy?" said James. Jack nodded. "That's what I'm going to call my rabbit," he said. "Great," said Mandy. "What color is he?" "Black and white," Jack said. "Just like his mom." Grandpa looked at Jack. "We'd better finish this hutch then, Jack," he said. "We want to have it ready in good time." Jack nodded. "But it'll be another 6 weeks before I can take Hoppy home," he said. "He's only 2 weeks old. He still needs his mother to feed him." "He'll soon be on solid food," said Mrs. Gardner. "Then you can feed him." "Laura says we can start giving him some solids when he's 3 or 4 weeks old," said Jack. "I can't wait to try feeding him, and I can't wait to take him home." "Then let's get busy," said Grandpa. "We want this hutch to be fit for a king." "Oh, we do," said Jack. "We really do." Mrs. Gardner looked at him. "He's a different boy these days," she said to Grandpa. "You and your wife have been so kind." "It's a pleasure," Grandpa said. "Why don't you go in and have a word with Dorothy?" His eyes twinkled. "And if she's putting the kettle on for a cup of tea, I wouldn't say no." Mrs. Gardner laughed and walked toward the house. "I'll tell her," she said. "Right," said Mandy, rolling up her sleeves. "I'll give James a hand with the go-kart." When Mandy and James finished painting the go-kart, it looked even better. They stood back and admired it. "Those black markings look really good," said Mandy. She looked at the picture of the cheetah James had pinned to the garage wall. "Just like the real thing," she said. James turned to look too. Then something ran between both them, whizzing around the paint cans. Mandy saw the yellow paint can rock slightly, then it tumbled over, spreading a pool of paint over the garage floor. "Blackie!" James shouted. The puppy stopped abruptly, turned around, skidded on the wet paint, and rolled over. "Oh, no!" said Mandy. Then she started to laugh. "What are you laughing for?" said James, as Blackie scooted off across the garden. "Look," said Mandy, pointing. Blackie's coat was patterned black and yellow all over. "He's like a miniature cheetah." James shook his head. "How on earth are we going to get that paint out of his coat?" Mandy bit her lip to stop laughing. "We'll ask Mom and Dad," she said. "They'll know what to do." "Paint remover," said Jack, turning around from the hutch. He looked a little sad for a moment. "Fred once got paint all over him. We got it off with paint remover, and then gave him a good shampoo." "Just make sure you don't get any of the fluid in his eyes," said Grandpa. "There's a bottle of it on the shelf here." "Thanks for the tip, Jack," James said. "I'll just see if I can catch him." Mandy walked over to Jack and the rabbit hutch. Grandpa and Jack had just finished nailing chicken wire onto one side of the hutch. "I'll help you with the hutch again tomorrow," she said. "There isn't much to do now, is there?" "We still have to make the doors, one solid and one with wire mesh for each part of the hutch," said Grandpa. He looked at Jack. "But I've got a great little helper here." Jack flushed with pride again. "Hoppy is going to love this hutch," he said. "I was in the pet shop in Walton yesterday. The owner showed me this special drinking bottle with a tube at the end. You fix it to the outside of the cage, and then the water stays clean. I'm saving up for one." Mandy examined the hutch. What a perfect home it was going to be for Jack's rabbit. She smiled to herself as Jack talked eagerly about Hoppy and his hutch. Jack had certainly changed since Hoppy had come into his life.